Most people think they know how they'd react with a 9mm pressed to their temple. Statistics say your heart rate should hit 180. You should scream. You should beg. But when 3 masked men stormed into a South Boston diner at 2 a.m., Zora Vance didn't do any of that. To the gunman, she was just an invisible face in a cheap uniform, a black waitress they could easily push around. But while the rest of the customers were sobbing on the floor, Zora didn't even stop pouring the coffee. She didn't look at the mask, she looked at the weapon. Then, with a voice as cold as a winter morgue, she told the lead gunman that his safety was on and his grip was trash. The diner went dead silent. And watching from the shadows of the back booth, Dante Moretti, a man who had spent his life killing, realized he hadn't just found a waitress. He'd found a queen who was more comfortable with a gun in her face than a tray in her hand. And he wasn't about to let her go. Welcome to my channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe. The rain was a relentless smear of gray against the windows of the diner, turning the neon, open, sign into a bleeding red bruise on the pavement. Inside, the air smelled of stale grease and burnt beans, thick with the heavy stillness of the graveyard shift. It was 2:14 a.m., the dead hour when the only people awake were the desperate, the lonely, or the dangerous. Zora Vance was none of those, or so the world thought. To the few regulars, she was just a pair of tired eyes and a steady hand, a woman who moved through the night like a ghost in a polyester uniform. The hum of the fluorescent lights was a constant, irritating vibration that felt like a needle pressing into the base of her skull. She was halfway through pouring a fresh cup for a silent man in the back booth when the front door hit the wall with a violence that made the ceramic mugs rattle on their saucers. 3 men, their faces obscured by cheap acrylic ski masks, surged into the room. The one in the lead brandished a handgun, his movements jerky and fueled by a volatile mix of adrenaline and desperation. Floor. Now. Everyone on the damn floor. The couple by the window didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled under the table in a tangle of limbs and muffled sobs. Old man Henderson just sat there, frozen, his fork halfway to his mouth as terror turned his breathing into a shallow, ragged whistle. Zora didn't move. She stood behind the counter, the glass coffee pot suspended in mid-air as she finished filling a mug. The liquid steamed, the aroma of hazelnut rising between her and the man who was now leveling a barrel at her forehead. "I said on the floor, bitch," the gunman screamed, his voice cracking. He stepped closer, the cold metal of the muzzle nearly brushing the bridge of her nose. Zora didn't blink. She didn't drop the pot, and she didn't let out so much as a tremor of a sigh. She simply tilted her head, her gaze shifting from his frantic, bloodshot eyes to the weapon in his shaking hand. "Do you want that loot to go?" she asked, her voice as flat and cool as a marble slab. "Because the registers are locked, the manager has the key to the safe, and I've got a floor to mop. If you're going to rob us, do it quickly. Some of us actually have work to do." The gunman hesitated, the sheer absurdity of her calm momentarily stalling his momentum. "You think this is a joke? I will blow your head off." "You'll try," Zora replied, stepping into his space rather than pulling away. She leaned over the counter, her eyes narrowing with a clinical, terrifying focus. "But your safety is still on. And that's a zinc alloy knockoff with a misaligned slide. If you actually try to pull that trigger, the back plate is going to shear off and bury itself in your eye. It's a paperweight, honey. Now, either buy a coffee or get out of my diner." In the shadows of the back booth, Dante Moretti didn't move a muscle. He watched the way her pulse didn't even quicken against the column of her throat. He didn't see a waitress. He saw a queen hiding in the ruins of a life she was clearly overqualified for. And in that moment, he knew he wasn't leaving without her. The silence that followed the gunman's retreat was heavier than the chaos they'd brought. The bell above the door jingled once, a mocking, cheerful sound in the wake of a near execution. Zora didn't exhale. She didn't lean against the counter to steady her legs. She simply picked up the damp rag she dropped and began to wipe the spot where the amateur's shaking hand had left a smudge on her glass. From the shadows of the back booth, Dante Moretti finally moved. He didn't rush. A man like Dante didn't need to hurry for anyone. He slid out of the vinyl seat, his charcoal suit jacket catching the dim, flickering light. He had watched the entire exchange with the clinical detachment of a man who saw violence as a primary language, and Zora had just spoken it with a fluency that was as beautiful as it was terrifying. He walked toward the counter, his presence heavy and suffocating, demanding the air in the small room. He didn't glance at the sobbing couple by the window or the shell-shocked man in the corner. His eyes were locked on Zora. Most people would be looking for a shot of whiskey right now, Dante said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that seemed to vibrate the very plates on the shelves. Or a priest. Zora didn't look up from her cleaning. Whiskey is for people who have something to forget. I just have a shift to finish. Dante reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a slim leather money clip. He didn't bother to count. He simply peeled off a thick stack of $100 bills, 10 of them, and laid them flat on the damp formica. The $1,000 sat there, crisp and insulting, under the buzzing fluorescent lights. For the coffee, Dante murmured. And for the show. It's been a long time since I've seen someone talk down a barrel without their pulse jumping a single beat. Zora finally looked at him. Her eyes weren't wide with gratitude or greed, they were narrow, sharp enough to draw blood. She didn't touch the money. Keep your theatrics, Mr. Moretti, she said. The use of his name made his eyes flicker, but he didn't interrupt. I don't sell shows. And I don't take tips from men who sit in the dark watching people almost get killed like it's a Broadway play. Take your cash and leave. You're drawing the kind of attention I don't want. Dante leaned in, his gaze dropping to her hands. As she gripped the rag to continue her work, the light caught the faint, jagged lines across her knuckles. They weren't from kitchen accidents or hot grease. They were the thin, white ghosts of old fractures, the kind earned from years of hitting things, or people, with professional precision. He realized then that the woman in the grease-stained apron was the most elaborate lie he had ever seen. She wasn't a victim of circumstance, she was a specialist in hiding. You have very interesting hands for a waitress, Zora, he said, a dangerous smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He didn't take the money back as he turned toward the door. I'll be seeing you. Rain or shine. The dawn light was as gray and unforgiving as the night before. By noon, the grainy cell phone footage captured by the young couple in the booth had racked up 1 million views, and the internet had christened her the Ice Queen of Boston. But for Zora Vance, fame was just another word for disaster. Her manager, a man who lived in a state of perpetual sweat, didn't see a viral sensation. He saw a neon sign for trouble. I can't have the news crews or the people you pissed off coming back here, he muttered, refusing to meet her gaze as he slid a final envelope across the counter. You're a liability, Zora. I'm sorry. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She simply took the envelope and walked out into the rain, the weight of the red-inked medical bills in her bag feeling heavier than a lead casket. Her apartment in Dorchester was a cramped box that smelled of damp wood and expensive desperation. She was staring at the final notice from her mother's care facility, the one threatening to transfer her to a state ward by the end of the month, when the knock came. It wasn't the landlord's frantic rapping. It was a heavy, deliberate sound that demanded entry. Dante Moretti looked like a god of the underworld standing in her narrow hallway. He didn't wait for an invitation, he stepped inside, his presence shrinking the small room instantly. He didn't look at the peeling wallpaper or the worn furniture. He looked at the file sitting on her kitchen table. High-intensity dementia care isn't cheap, Dante said, his low baritone cutting through the sound of the rain against the glass. 30,000 in arrears. They're going to move her by Friday, Zora. You know what happens to people in state wards. They fade. Zora's jaw tightened, her fingers curling until the faint white scars on her knuckles stood out in sharp relief. How did you find this? I find everything, Dante replied, stepping closer until she could smell the faint scent of cedar and expensive tobacco. I don't want a waitress. I want a manager for the Aura Club, my primary front. I need someone who knows how to spot a threat before it speaks. Someone who doesn't blink when the world gets loud. He didn't offer a hand to shake. He offered a way out. $3,000 a week. Cash. The medical debts vanish tonight. You trade the apron for a blazer, and you keep my house in order. Do we have an agreement, or do you want to keep mopping floors while your mother forgets your name? Zora looked at the final notice, then up at the man who was either her savior or her ruin. She didn't hesitate this time. She couldn't afford to. When do I start? Tonight, he said, a dark glint in his eyes as he turned toward the door. The world is waiting to see the queen. The Gilded Lily was a world away from the hum of the diner's flickering fluorescent lights. Here, the air was thick with the scent of amber, expensive gin, and the quiet rustle of silk. Zora adjusted the sleeves of her tailored black blazer, the fabric a sharp, suffocating contrast to the grease-stained polyester she had worn for years. She moved through the velvet-draped lounge not like an employee, but like a shadow that finally belonged in the dark corners of power. In the VIP section, the atmosphere had curdled. Senator Whitmore, a man whose public persona was built on family values and a firm handshake, had his fingers gripped too tightly around a young server's wrist. His face was flushed with the heat of expensive bourbon and the arrogance of a man who believed he owned everything he touched. The girl was pale, her tray trembling as she tried to pull away without making a scene. Zora stepped into the pool of light. She didn't call for security, and she didn't raise her voice. She simply leaned over the senator's table, her presence a cold weight that seemed to drop the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. "Senator," she murmured, her voice a cool, dangerous silk. "I'd be very careful with that grip. The specialized lens hidden in the center of that chandelier has an exceptionally clear view of your right hand." Whitmore froze, his eyes darting upward. There was nothing there but crystal and light, but the seed of doubt took root instantly. "I don't know what you're talking about," he hissed, though his fingers instinctively loosened. "Of course you don't," Zora replied, leaning in closer as if sharing an intimate secret. "But digital cloud storage is a permanent record. It would be a devastating blow to your re-election if the Morning Globe saw how you treat the working class after that charity speech you gave on Tuesday. Why don't you let the lady go, order a sparkling water, and we'll both pretend you're the gentleman your voters think you are?" Whitmore recoiled as if stung, his entitlement collapsing into a frantic, sweating panic. He let go of the girl and sank back into the velvet, staring at his drink in a stunned, humiliated silence. Zora gave the server a brief, steadying nod, sending her back toward the safety of the bar before she turned back to the room, her expression unreadable. From the mezzanine above, Dante Moretti watched the entire exchange. He didn't miss the way Zora never once checked for a camera, because he knew, and she knew, there wasn't one. It had been a pure bluff, a psychological strike delivered with surgical precision. He swirled the ice in his glass, a dark spark of appreciation igniting in his eyes. He had hired her because she was brave, but he was starting to realize he had acquired something far more lethal. Zora Vance didn't just survive the world, she mapped it. She wasn't just a manager on his floor, she was a strategist who saw the entire room as a chessboard, and she had already put the senator in checkmate before he even realized the game had begun. Dante realized then that he hadn't just found a protector for his club, he had found the architect for his empire. The heavy oak doors of the Gilded Lily swung open, and the refined hum of the room died a sudden, violent death. Marco Valli didn't walk into a room, he invaded it. A mid-level underboss for the Valenti family, Marco was a man built of equal parts scar tissue and insecurity. He was flanked by two men who looked like they chewed gravel for breakfast, and he was shouting for Dante before he even reached the bar. Zora moved to intercept him before he could reach the mezzanine stairs. She didn't hurry, her heels clicking against the marble in a steady, lethal rhythm. "Mr. Valli," she said, her voice a cool barrier. "Mr. Moretti is in a private meeting. You don't have an invitation." Marco stopped, his face flushing a mottled purple. He looked Zora up and down, his lip curling in a sneer that didn't quite hide the flicker of recognition. "I know you. You're the little waitress from the video." The one who thinks she's got ice in her veins. He leaned in, his breath a foul mix of cigars and entitlement. Dante's got you playing dress up, but you're still just a girl who clears tables. To punctuate his point, Marco reached for a bottle of Cristal sitting on a nearby patron's table. With a casual, violent flick of his wrist, he shattered it against the edge of the bar. Glass sprayed like diamonds across the polished floor, and the golden liquid soaked into the expensive rug. Look at that, Marco laughed, the sound harsh and grating. A mess. Why don't you get on your knees and clean that up, manager? Show everyone what you're really good for. The room went graveyard silent. Security moved forward, but Zora raised a single hand, stopping them in their tracks. She didn't look at the mess. She didn't look at Marco's goons. She looked directly into Marco's eyes with a stare so devoid of heat it was practically prehistoric. Slowly, deliberately, Zora reached down. Her fingers didn't tremble as she bypassed the smaller fragments and picked up a jagged, 6-inch shard of the bottle's neck. The edges were razor-sharp, glinting under the chandelier light. She stepped into Marco's personal space, moving so close the sharp point of the glass was inches from his jugular. Marco's laughter died in his throat. He tried to pull back, but found he couldn't move. It was as if her gaze had pinned him to the floor. Zora took his hand, the one that had broken the bottle, and pressed the jagged glass into his palm, closing his fingers around the sharp edges until a thin line of red began to seep between his knuckles. My house has a very strict policy, Marco, she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying like a gunshot in the quiet room. Children aren't welcome here, especially when they play with things they don't understand. Take your trash and get out. If you break something else in my club, I won't give the pieces back so politely. Marco stared at his bleeding hand, the bravado draining out of him as if she'd pulled a plug. He didn't say another word. He turned and stumbled toward the exit, his goons following like whipped dogs. Zora didn't watch him leave. She simply looked at the bartender. Get a mop. We have a reputation to maintain. The velvet curtains of the Gilded Lily's private lounge were designed to muffle sound, but they couldn't stop the vibrations of a voice Zora recognized in her marrow. She was adjusting the inventory in the narrow corridor behind the bar when the back service door creaked open. It was a restricted area, a place where the shadows were thick and the air smelled of damp brick. You were supposed to end him right there in the booth, a low, raspy voice hissed. It was Leo, one of Dante's most trusted captains, a man who had sat at Dante's right hand for a decade. The girl, another voice stammered. It was high-pitched, frantic, and laced with the tremors of a withdrawal. The black waitress. She wasn't part of the plan, man. She looked at the gun like it was a toy. I froze. I couldn't pull the trigger with her staring into my soul like that. Zora froze, her breath catching in her throat. She knew that voice. It was the lead gunman from the diner, the one who had leveled a zinc alloy knockoff at her forehead. The random robbery hadn't been random at all. It had been a staged execution, a calculated hit designed to look like a botched heist so Leo could step over Dante's corpse and claim the throne. You're a coward, Miller, Leo spat, the sound of a heavy blow echoing in the corridor followed by a muffled groan. Dante's getting soft. He's distracted by that same girl now, bringing her into the inner circle. It's an insult. If you can't finish it, I'll find someone who will. The poker game in Chelsea is the move. Be ready. The heavy door slammed shut, leaving Zora in a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped turning. Her heart didn't race, her training, the cold discipline inherited from a father who lived by the code of the hunt, wouldn't allow it. Instead, her mind became a sharpened blade. If she went to Dante now, it would be her word against his longest-serving captain. In the world of the Moretti family, an accusation without proof was a death sentence for the accuser. Dante was a man of logic and loyalty. He wouldn't burn a brother on the whispers of a woman he'd known for a week. She leaned her head against the cool brick wall, the white scars on her knuckles aching. She couldn't tell him. Not yet. She would have to let the play unfold, stepping into the line of fire before the bullet even left the chamber. Dante had hired her to manage his club, but he was about to realize he'd hired the only person capable of saving his life from the people he loved most. She wouldn't be his informant, she would be his shield. The Chelsea game was in 48 hours. Zora straightened her blazer, her eyes turning into flint. She had 2 days to make sure that when the traitor finally made his move, he found her waiting in the dark. The Chelsea warehouse smelled of industrial sawdust and expensive cigars, a cavernous space where the city's elite criminals gathered to trade fortunes under the dim glow of low-hanging lamps. Dante sat at the center table, his face a mask of cool indifference as he pushed a stack of high-value chips into the pot. To anyone else, Zora was just his silent shadow, standing 3 paces behind him with a tray of untouched drinks. But while the men focused on their cards, Zora was reading the architecture of the room. Her eyes tracked the shadows. She wasn't looking at the players, she was looking at the ventilation ducts, the service catwalks, and the heavy iron rafters. That was when she saw it, a microscopic flicker of light, a silver glint no larger than a needle's head, reflecting off a glass lens high in the darkness. Dante, down. The command left her throat with the force of a physical blow. She didn't wait for him to react. She lunged forward, her fingers threading into the collar of his charcoal suit and yanking him backward with a strength born of pure adrenaline. They hit the concrete floor just as the deafening crack of a high-caliber rifle shattered the air. The heavy oak poker table exploded into a cloud of splinters and Green felt exactly where Dante's chest had been a millisecond before. Chaos erupted. The overhead lights were blown out, plunging the room into a strobe-lit nightmare of muzzle flashes and screaming men. From the side entrance, a flanking squad of gunmen burst in, their shadows elongated and monstrous against the brick walls. One of Dante's guards fell beside them, his weapon skidding across the grit-covered floor. Zora didn't hesitate. She rolled over the cold concrete, her hands snapping onto the grip of the discarded semi-automatic with the muscle memory of a ghost reclaiming its life. She rose into a low, tactical crouch, her feet braced and her spine straight. The first gunman rounded a stack of crates, his weapon leveled at the spot where Dante was scrambling to cover. Zora didn't close an eye to aim, she saw the world in a wide, lethal arc. She squeezed the trigger twice. 2 muffled pops echoed through the warehouse, and the gunman dropped instantly, 2 perfect holes centered in his chest. She pivoted 45 degrees, her movements fluid and devoid of the panicked jerking of an amateur. Her breathing remained rhythmic, a sharp contrast to the frantic shouting filling the room. Dante, reaching for his own weapon, froze for a split second as he looked up at her. In the flickering light of the gunfire, he didn't see a waitress or a manager. He saw a predator in a blazer, a woman who moved with the chilling, practiced grace of a soldier who had been raised in the dark. Zora Vance wasn't just shielding him, she was clearing the room with a cold, terrifying efficiency that proved she was the most dangerous person in the warehouse. The air in the remote cabin smelled of pine needles and old cedar, a stark, clean contrast to the metallic scent of the warehouse. Outside, the Massachusetts woods were a wall of black silence, providing a sanctuary that the city could never offer. Inside, the only light came from a single kerosene lamp that cast long, dancing shadows against the log walls. Dante sat on the edge of a wooden crate, his charcoal suit jacket discarded and his white shirt torn open at the shoulder. A shallow groove from a grazing bullet marred his tanned skin, the blood sluggishly beginning to clot. Zora moved with steady, unhurried precision, her hands dipping a cloth into a basin of warm water. "You move like a ghost, but you shoot like a shadow with a grudge," Dante murmured, his voice tight as she pressed the cloth to the wound. He looked up at her, his dark eyes searching hers for a crack in the armor. Where does a waitress learn to lead a target like a professional hitman? Zora didn't look up, her focus remaining on the triage. My father didn't believe in dolls or bedtime stories. He believed in windage, elevation, and the 3 pounds of pressure it takes to change a life forever. She paused, her fingers brushing the skin near the graze. He was Marcus Vance, lead tactical detective for the Special Response Unit. Before the city broke him, he spent 18 years teaching me that in a world of predators, Hesitation is the only sin that carries a death sentence. Dante went still. The name Marcus Vance was a legend in the underworld, a man who had been too clean to buy and too smart to kill, until he simply vanished. He looked at the faint white scars on Zora's knuckles again, finally understanding the weight they carried. She wasn't just a survivor of a bad neighborhood, she was the legacy of a man who had declared war on the very world Dante ruled. He taught me how to see the glint of a lens before the shooter even finds their breath, she continued, finally meeting his gaze. He taught me that when the world catches fire, you don't run. You become the flame. Dante reached up, his hand covering hers as she held the bandage. The heat between them was sudden and atmospheric, a physical pull that felt more dangerous than the ambush they had just escaped. They were two broken shards from the same jagged mirror, forged in the same cold darkness, recognizing the same loneliness in each other's eyes. He pulled her closer, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Zora didn't pull away. The distance between them vanished in a desperate, high-stakes kiss that tasted of iron and adrenaline. It wasn't soft, it was a collision of two people who had spent their lives waiting for the other shoe to drop, finally finding a place where they didn't have to watch their own backs. In the quiet of the safe house, the waitress and the boss were gone, replaced by two survivors who had finally found the only other person in the world who wasn't afraid of the dark. The fire in the safe house had died down to embers by the time the sun rose, but the fire Zora and Dante carried back to Boston was enough to incinerate the city. They didn't return as victims of a failed coup, they returned as a reckoning. With Zora's tactical mind mapping the traitor's movements and Dante's reach, the purge was swift and absolute. Leo's betrayal ended in a cold warehouse much like the one where he'd tried to kill his boss, and by the time the smoke cleared, the hierarchy of the Moretti family had been rebuilt with Zora Vance as its cornerstone. 6 months later, the rain was once again hammering against the windows of the old diner in South Boston, but the world inside had changed. The flickering fluorescent lights had been replaced with warm, recessed lighting, and the smell of stale grease was gone, replaced by the scent of expensive dark roast and fresh cedar. Dante and Zora didn't just sit in the back booth anymore, they owned it. Along with the diner, the apartment complex next door, and every storefront on the block. Zora sat across from Dante, wearing a silk suit that cost more than her old manager had made in a year. Her knuckles were still scarred, but now she wore a heavy diamond band that glinted in the soft light. She was lifting a cup of coffee to her lips when the front door swung open with a familiar, violent thud. A young man, barely 20, stumbled in with a bandana over his face and a rusted revolver shaking in his hand. He looked frantic, his eyes darting around the near-empty room until they landed on the well-dressed couple in the back. "Empty the register," he screamed, his voice cracking with a fear he was trying to hide behind the gun. "Now! Or I'll start shooting." The server behind the counter froze, but Zora didn't even set her cup down. She didn't look at the gun, and she didn't look at the masked face. She simply leaned back against the vinyl seat and checked her watch with a bored, clinical detachment. "You have exactly 10 seconds to put that toy in your waistband and walk out that door before the 3 men standing on the sidewalk behind you decide to make an example of you," Zora said, her voice a low, melodic threat that carried more weight than any scream. "And for future reference, the hammer on that revolver is bent. If you pull it, the only person getting hurt is you." The boy's eyes went wide. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the silhouettes of 3 massive men in black overcoats standing perfectly still in the rain, watching him through the glass. The air in the room seemed to vanish. He didn't say a word, he simply tucked the gun away and bolted out the door, disappearing into the night. Zora took a calm sip of her coffee, her expression unbothered. Dante watched her, his pride visible in the slight curve of his mouth. The waitress who had served coffee in the shadows was gone. The queen had taken her throne, and in the underworld of Boston, everyone finally knew that the most dangerous person in the room wasn't the one holding the gun, it was the woman who wasn't afraid to let it click. True strength is rarely found in the roar of a crowd or the thunder of a gunshot. It is found in the quiet, the stillness of a mind that refuses to break when the world is on fire. Zora Vance's journey from a grease-stained apron to a velvet throne teaches us that the ultimate equalizer isn't power, money, or even luck. It is preparation and a lack of fear. In a world of predators, she survived not by being the loudest, but by being the most observant, proving that the person who keeps their head while others are losing theirs is the one who eventually wears the crown. But every crown comes with a price, and every throne is built on the ruins of the life left behind. Zora Vance went from a $12 an hour waitress to the sovereign of the Boston underworld, trading her anonymity for a lethal legacy. Now, I have to ask you, do you think she made the right choice by embracing the darkness to save her family, or did she lose her soul to the very world she once tried to escape? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you were gripped by this saga of the Ice Queen and her Mafia boss, make sure to smash that like button. It tells the algorithm that we need more stories of high-stakes romance and tactical brilliance. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you're the first to know when the next story drops. Thanks for watching, and remember, stay calm, stay sharp, and never let them see you flinch.